We are going to now just have our team conversation again. But before we do that, I want us to rehearse a bit what we heard yesterday. Next. Okay. So just I'm going to highlight a few things we heard from ODPC's story that I want us to be just reflect on a bit. So yesterday, when ODPC pastors share their story, they began first with giving us what their neighborhood is like and how it is changing and what might be new ministry opportunities in that neighborhood in which their church is located. My family moved down to Northern Virginia. My dad was the founding pastor of an Open Door Presbyterian Church in 1978. And when we moved down to Northern Virginia, Fairfax County in 1978, it was predominantly white community. Yesterday, they pointed out 49% of now people who live in Northern Virginia are non-white families, many of whom are immigrants. That's a pretty significant shift. In fact, they said now the world is in our backyard. You know, our churches are located in those neighborhoods that are constantly changing. Our mission field is constantly changing. So unless you pause and intentionally study what your neighborhood is like today, we can often come up with some kind of outreach plan that is based on what we knew 20 years ago. And I noticed that one of the churches, I believe is a Monmouth, they put up their poster in which says, you know, first work we need to do is trying to understand what our Judea and Samaria is like today. And I also make a mental note myself. Next time when we do this cohort learning journey again, I'm going to ask each church before coming to this particular session to do their neighborhood study first. So that when you come, you have a more accurate information about who are the people who are moving into our backyards, right? Maybe it's not just Monmouth Church, but all of us. When we go back to our churches, maybe one of the first things we need to do is to study, to see what our neighborhood is actually like today, right? So that's what I heard yesterday. Second thing, different approaches. I thought this was very insightful. They said the first generation members and leaders, how they would like to do outreach is by having a big event on campus and gather people to church campus. So there are pros at putting together programs that attract people to our campus. But the second generation, they said, we are better at scattering. And so I think Pastor John said, we changed our name of a small group from small group to gospel communities. Well, clearly two different approaches. Now, notice they did not say, first generation said, hey, second generation, you shouldn't scatter, you should help us to gather. Or second generation did not tell the first generation, you know, you need to scatter. That's what Jesus told the disciples to do. No judgmental estimate of what each other is doing. Allowing and enabling each congregation to understand what their effective approach is and do so, right? But having said that, they are still collaborating together. And that's the third point they made. Learning together about God's mission, sending together, and then going together. And one of the things that I noticed was that as they do these three things, learning together, sending together, going together, they're also, it seemed like very intentional about creating certain artifacts. Remember those photos of a joint commissioning service, right? They're creating new artifacts in their churches that would shape what I might call missional congregational culture. So last year or so, all our churches have been working on creating intergenerational artifacts that is more about fellowship among our church members and leaders. Now, I want you to think now, bring that to missional outreach. How you might create new artifact in your church that would enable your generations to learn together, to send together, to go together in doing God's mission in Judea, Samaria, and ends of the earth. I also noticed one of the pastors said, for our church, we intentionally do our joint generational mission week in February. Instead of waiting until October and November, which is usually mission week for many churches, they wanted to do it in February. And then I think they were intentionally mentioning this too, to communicate to our congregation members that we prioritize doing missions together as the most important thing. So the first joint activity that they do with different congregations is doing the mission week together. That's a powerful symbol, isn't it? That's a powerful artifact to remind the church that we begin new year together by focusing on God's mission for us. This morning, around your table, what I want to encourage you is you all came up with the different activities you want to do. I want you to actually plan out some new artifacts for your church that would strengthen your mission and that would strengthen your church's intergenerational culture. Now let's go to the second case study we heard, Mosaic Initiative. They said many things, but this is what I heard. One, God leads, we follow. It was very clear for them, and I know their story well because I've worked very closely with them. We did not have a clear blueprint of what might happen 5 years from now. But we were very intentional, partly because we didn't have a clear picture, that we wanted to begin by hearing what God had to say. So when 12 churches came together, the very first thing was very powerful worship that was led by 12 young adult leaders from 12 churches. A joint praise team, young adults led that worship, and it was just powerful time of unity, but then also that led us into monthly prayer gatherings where we began to ask God, Waukegan has so many challenges that even politicians have given up on this church. In what ways can churches come together and serve your mission in this community? God leads, we follow. And flowing from that is commitment to prayerful, relational, and responsive outreach. And yesterday, I'm not sure if they mentioned this, but these 11 or 12 churches, they're all located in Waukegan. So if you ask those pastors and leaders and young adults in the church, what do you think are needs of the Waukegan community? I'm sure they could readily come up with right away, like a list of 10, 20 different things that they think is needed by families and individuals in Waukegan. But instead, as a leadership, we decided, we think we know what the needs of this city is, but let's just make sure we are on target. So what we did was we did listening sessions with the non-Christian young adults in Waukegan. So we basically asked the young adults from our church, 12 churches, to bring their non-Christian friends to a pizza gathering. Not all of them came, but many came. And we decided to not hold it at the church, but an outside location. And then we asked them, what are your needs? In what ways can church might be helpful? Wow. What we thought was going to be 1.5 hour conversation went into 2-3 hours. And there are many things that came out of that that help us to focus on what should be our priorities. Right? Responsive, relational. I want us to think about that. What might that look like in your community? Right? And then third one, I'm going to end with this one. City asks the church for help. Remember that part of their presentation? City mayor is now coming to this church pastor and say, we need your help. And I think it was Pastor Paul Kim who said that, will anyone notice if and when we move away to another location? In other words, the people in our church's neighborhood, will they notice that something is missing if your church decides to move to another location? Or will they simply say, I think there was a church here. And in fact, that's the church that caused a lot of parking problem on a Sunday mornings, right? Or here's a bit sad story. There is a town called Wheeling, not far from here, that because the property is cheaper, a lot of the immigrant churches were trying to locate their church in that Wheeling. And I was told by one of the immigrant church pastors who tried that and got denied. And I said, why is Wheeling denying permission for a church to be built there? And this is what he said, because the mayor's office said, if we have more church come into Wheeling, we lose. Because we lose a tax base. If that property went to a commercial building, we will gain a tax. It goes to church, we gain nothing. But you know what's sad about that statement? They don't think of church as something that adds to the community. But in fact, church is sometimes seen as a deficit. How do we become a salt and light in this kind of setting in such a way that if your church moves away to another location, that your neighborhood feel like we're missing something here? Wish they were here. What might that look like? That's what they shared yesterday that I thought was very helpful.